I'm very excited to have you because I have, as a longtime advocate of Palestinian emancipation, I have seen your journey and your transformation, and it's something that I admire. I think it's very courageous, but also the way you've communicated about this, about both Palestine in the Message, your new book that just came out, but also the way you have carried yourself in these sometimes contentious media environments, I think is really wonderful, especially because you always try to do something that I always try to do as well, which is like use the privilege that you have and the space that you have and the social capital that you have to like reframe the conversation back to issues that matter, instead of engaging in the palace intrigue, engaging in like the stuff that is almost entirely too self-centered for Western media audiences. Like, oh, the way that what's the broad reception of Ta-Nehisi Coates like in Western media? Is that like no longer a positive thing? Where you always, I notice, take that conversation back to issues that really matter, like speaking for people who do not have a voice in the Western media landscape, and even if you have like a meta analysis or a meta conversation about this the lack of visibility for Palestinians in Western media, you still oftentimes I feel like recognize that you're not the perfect person to be having these conversations, and that in and of itself is a problem as well. That like there is no Palestinian visibility, like direct Palestinian American visibility in mainstream outlets in the same way that it exists for people who are pro-Israel. Anyway, I talked a lot. Sorry, it is what I do. I do have a tendency to do that.
It's the privilege of having a show.
I'm fanboying a little bit, and I'm not very good at this sort of thing. But I wanted to start off with your own personal journey. You wrote about very famously about reparations, making a case for reparations for Black Americans, and you used Israel as an example. So let's start off there. How did that work for you? Like, how did you arrive at this initially?
Yeah, I mean, what I'll say is I think like the challenge of writing is you have to draw a straight line when things are not necessarily always a straight line. And so I think it's really important that a couple of things be acknowledged. I came from a community of activism. My dad was in the Panther Party. My mom was very politically conscious. And so, yeah, I came from a household that probably did not have the most detailed understanding of what was happening in Palestine, but definitely understood themselves as Black Americans and Black people as an oppressed group, and saw that in Palestinians, and saw the Israelis, much as white Americans here were identified as the oppressive class here, saw the same thing in the Israelis. These thoughts and these notions were in my around, and even when I was at Howard, they were around. One of the difficulties is though when you go into the kind of journalism I was going into, and particularly at that moment, I think there were two things. I think one, to a degree that I probably did not understand and appreciate, there is a kind of mainstream journalism that is in direct reaction to some of the more idealistic impulses of the left. And I don't say idealistic as a slur, but the notion is, I think, among certain people that those of us who really do believe in changing the world, those of us who really do believe, like in the household I came up in, that something really truly radical needs to happen to make this world a more fair and a more just place, that kind of analysis falls down under the work of details. Like that's just a kind of baseline, I think, sort of understanding. So, even in making the case for reparations, I was myself working against that. Now I was working against it in a very, sort of particular way. But, you're always trying to make your case to people who, don't necessarily, think as you do and don't come up thinking as you do. And part of that is making it as concrete as you possibly can. I was in a newsroom where There were no other Black editors and maybe one other Black writer at that point, but maybe also not. There certainly weren't any Palestinian American editors or writers. And if there were Arab American editors, I didn't know it. It's possible they were there and I just didn't, it went right over my head or whatever. But certainly no one who would have had an experience critical of or skeptical of Zionism, except me, the one I had in my house, had hands on that piece of journalism. And so it was just a case, first of all, where, I did something that I advise, my writing students to never do in the message. And that is, you draw conclusions about something that you have not been sufficiently curious about. And what I would say is I was at that point in time, and I guess still am, working in a milieu where there was a kind of just default Zionism. This is not a thought out Zionism. It's not I have, developed, strong notions or strong feelings, but it's the belief that there is a group of people in this world who have suffered some 2,000 years of oppression, and that somehow a state is justice to make up for that oppression, which is, the oppression is very, very real. I think the state as a kind of make good is another question. And then the other half of it is probably, something that you've experienced and talked about quite a bit, and that is that there is considerable amount of pressure to remain incurious, to not ask questions, to not, ask why, and whatever my faults were in that piece, and it was an extensive one. I felt like I had my own personal reparation to make, and when for me as a writer, what that means is then asking questions, evincing that kind of curiosity. That was not in that piece. It took 10 years to do that, but that's what that large second half of the message actually is.
So can you walk me through the aspects of this journey that that revolve around self-reflection? Because let me present you with my way of viewing the world, and maybe we'll come to an agreement. But something that you actually just mentioned is like the default position that a lot of people take for granted in terms of the way people look at Zionism, right? Where they're like, or the way people analyze Israel, where they're like, no, this is the most moral nation. It has to exist. What are you talking about? This is a democracy. This is the only democracy in the Middle East. Now, of course, the truth is very different than that. But a lot of people don't examine it because that's all they've seen, and they take that information for granted. And I think this type of social conditioning exists for bigotries of every sort, and it is a byproduct of the white supremacist systems that we exist under, in my opinion, where a lot of people, I think, take for granted white supremacist tendencies that they might have, like anti-black tendencies that they might have, and I think it requires self-examination, but that's why I'm always very charitable to people that maybe even engage in like microaggressions, right? Every now and then, because I understand that as long as they have this charity, as long as they are on a journey of learning and self-reflection, I get where their starting position is. And it's the same for the way people analyze Israel, and it's the same for the way people even analyze or the way people look at, domestic affairs. And I think it's important to have that charity for others and recognize why people that don't examine these sorts of things, like why they might develop this attitude, whether it be for Israel or anything else.
Yeah, Hasan, I agree with that. But what I would add to that is there is also a tendency when criticism is not voiced in a way that you would like, in a way that makes you feel good about yourself, in a way that does not, that wounds you. There is a tendency among writers, and particularly writers with privilege and power, to immediately go into their shell and become defensive because somebody has said something in a way that they didn't like. The beginnings of this, for me, in terms of the message, is not somebody politely pulling me aside behind stage and saying, I'm a huge fan of your work and I really love you and you're the greatest writer on earth, but you just did this one little thing. I got critiqued. I got yelled at.
It
Was it
was Rena
fun?
Kalik, I
No.
think, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, she was one. She was one. But
Yeah.
also, there was a professor who actually, the first thing I actually saw, I did see that, and that was, obviously, in that environment was significant and important, and took quite a bit of courage. But my now friend, Bo Conley, who wrote, I'm sorry, Nathan Conley, Don Conley, Nathan Conley, who's a professor at Johns Hopkins, who, wrote, a piece very, very early on critiquing it. And, what I'm trying to say is, names aside, is I think more writers, when they see a group of people yelling at them, or when they see somebody yelling at them, I think a lot of us could be less dismissive about that. You're right. I do think it's good to be charitable, but I also think, when you have power, when you have the ability, when you have, as I did at that time, the cover of the Atlantic, that's a lot of power, man. That's a lot of power. And so with that, should come some charity from our part too. And I wish that was more evident. I wish that was more evident.
Yeah. No, I love the way you've navigated and so publicly navigated in this space, and the very fact that you have expended some social capital, I think, in this process. And I also do think that you understand, just as I do, and I'm a communicator by trade as well, that ultimately it's nothing it's nothing as far as like saying the truth and constantly working in pursuit of the truth, but also nothing in comparison to, I think, the daily experiences that Palestinians go through living under permanent occupation and apartheid, and currently surviving a genocide. So I think it's what's up?
Can I just very gently push back against this social capital thing, if I could?
Okay. Yeah.
So like I think it's worth. I guess I feel two ways about it. I feel like I understand what you're saying, and I think it's true. But I would like, if you and your audience will understand something about me, and that is, I come from an experience where the things that it may seem like I would be rewarded for as a writer, most people just kind of don't care too much about. Most people who are in my life, most people who I love, most people who I, probably feel the most loyal to. I mean, they're happy, that, I'm being read by a lot of people. They're happy if I get an award. They're happy, if I'm on a certain show. But it is not how they ascribe value to who I am. And what I mean by that, or why I'm saying that, is those are the people to whom I'm accountable to. Those are the people who will ultimately, judge me. And so it's like there are a circle of people around me who exert more weight than any booker for any show, or any sort of editor at any magazine, who are not writers and who are not particularly public people, but would be deeply disappointed in me if I were not proceeding in an ethical way. And I look, I don't, obviously this is our first time talking, but I've seen you on a number of shows at this point beyond your own show, and my sense is you did not get on those shows by trying to get on those shows. That you got on those shows actually by being loyal to something that was here. You know what I mean? It actually had nothing to do with, with whatever. And I just think that's important to reflect. You know what I mean? I think it's important as if we're doing an unk off here, to all the young nephews and nieces, you know what I mean, coming up. Like I think it's important. Like, you can be loyal to other things. You know what I'm saying? And you can take that whole social capital conversation, you know what I mean, and not make it core to, who you are and what's important to you.
No, the only reason why I mentioned that is because it's not for you in particular, but it's for the way I look at this. Like, people benefit from leaning into pre-existing hierarchies and not really disrupting them, and not really coming out with like bold declarative statements. It can sometimes be a gap in education or your personal experiences, like understanding what apartheid looked like until experiencing it with firsthand accounts, which I do want to get to in a second. Or it can be, in other instances, like a cynical way where you know what the truth is, but you choose not to reveal it or not to talk about it because you are worried about advancement. You're worried about your career taking a downturn. And I think that there are a lot of people who are cynical in that regard, especially in the media landscape. So I do admire people who who will openly say, I was wrong in the past and I'm making up for it now, because I think that's necessary and I think that's healthy. I think it's a healthy attitude to have. And I think people have that attitude in their interpersonal relationships.
Yes.
But the way they carry themselves both online and in the media landscape, there is no reward for it. And because there is no reward for it, and the reward is just simply saying the truth, right? But people do end up getting somewhat punished for it, and you only get rewarded if you double down on speaking on telling an alternative narrative that you might even know is not entirely true. That's the reason why I am explaining to people that are listening that there is value here, and that's what I mean. Because, like, if I'm going to be very real, if I'm going to be brutally honest, you could have continued never speaking about Israel ever again. You could have changed your perception. You could have changed your mind. No, I know. But I'm saying that, like, in an alternative scenario, in an alternative universe, where there's a different Ta-Nehisi Coates who saw the truth and was still more personally invested in continuing to have like a media career that he cares about. Some people do care about these things. Clearly, I think the vast landscape is dominated by people that are careerists, that are personally invested in their own success and don't necessarily have this ambition to speak the truth, no matter how hard, no matter how difficult that task may be. And that's why I think it's important to be honest and highlight that. Now,
and I appreciate that, brother. I do. Yeah. I appreciate that. I don't want to come off as unappreciative.
That ultimately is still, and this is something that I also want to stress, is still inconsequential in the grand scheme of things, because what you are trying to do, I think, is exactly what I've also been trying to do on a multitude of different issues, which is utilizing the privilege that you have and utilizing the privilege that I have for offering a voice to people that are otherwise voiceless, while simultaneously also saying you shouldn't be the person to even, like, the very fact that you yourself are the messenger, right? In this process, it, I think, shows a gap, an asymmetry that is worthy of criticism in and of itself. The fact that it's the fact that there is no entrenched Palestinian position in any Western media operation is a issue that's worthy of criticism in and of itself. And I think you do a great job of pointing that out as well in this process.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. And I think, well, on the one hand, it obviously makes it easier to inflict apartheid, to inflict genocide in service of apartheid. It also makes it easier because Americans are dumber for it. We are more ignorant for not hearing from that person. We don't, understand. We don't get a clear picture of, I mean, you kind of, hinted at it when you started off this conversation, this whole, and this is what I meant by default Zionism. Like, this vocabulary just kind of goes uncritiqued. Only democracy in the Middle East has the right to defend itself.
Yeah.
Has the right to exist. And it's just said so much that it just becomes part of the milieu and the air, and nobody says, you know what I mean? Well, hold up. Well, what actually is a democracy? Is this actually democratic? Is it democratic to hold half of the population under your rule on a separate tier from the other half? What part of democracy is that? the right to defend itself, but the right to defend itself from what? The right to exist. The right to exist as what? As what?
Yeah.
And so I think like those kind of second level, third level questions are shunted off in favor of these kind of cute, catchphrases. And what happens is, because those questions don't get asked, because reporters don't ask them, man. I mean, and this is, what I was saying earlier. I just want to be, absolutely clear about this. We failed on this because those second level and third level questions do not get asked of representatives. Viewers and readers are dumber for it. They're dumber for it. And it's incredibly sad. It's incredibly sad. I can only give what I saw and what I read over the past year preparing this work. But there are people who have imbibed the collective wisdom of living under it. I mean, one of the critiques I got was, well, you were only over there for 10 days. You're correct. I wish you would get somebody on there that has lived their life over there under it. I will happily step aside for that person.
Yeah.
Where are they?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's an insidious thought terminating like linguistic thing that people utilize, and sometimes it masquerades as like innocent, innocuous, but it is actually serving a very dangerous purpose overall, which is to mask the systems of violence that the daily existence of apartheid require. You cannot maintain an apartheid without a constant surveillance state. You cannot maintain an apartheid without constant violence, without checkpoints. Things that you saw, it only took you maybe not even 10 days. I assume it took you just one day to immediately recognize what was going on. A similar thing happened to Jamal Bowman as well when he went to the West Bank with J Street. And that was his wake up call, his moment of recognition. So could you talk a little bit about your experience in Hebron specifically, and just in the West Bank as well, that caused you to fully realize what was going on?
Yeah, it's very painful. First of all, Hebron is very poor. That's the first thing. And I should make that. Let me clarify that. Palestinians who live in the old city of Hebron are very poor. They're very poor because their shops and markets have been completely shut down. Because every step that they take is patrolled, and they have to navigate a series of checkpoints and security. And the checkpoints take various forms. The gates. Sometimes it's just a soldier standing there. I watched a soldier with a huge automatic rifle turn back two kids as they made their way to school. And this kind of surveillance, this kind of violent surveillance is not true of everyone who lives in the old city of Hebron. It's true of Palestinians who live in the old city of Hebron. And so for somebody who was reared on stories of Jim Crow, who came up under that as a collective experience, as an African-American, first of all, you drive to, Hebron. We were coming from Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, to get there. And we are driving on roads that are delineated for Palestinians. And there are separate roads delineated for Jewish citizens or citizens of Israel and Jewish settlers of the West Bank. Those roads are not the same quality, are not the same, efficiency. One is more circuitous than the other. One is direct, the other is not. We are driving past homes in which you can clearly see the difference between a settlement and where Palestinians live. They're denoted by, the red groups that we learned to look out for the settlers. You talk to people who live in those Palestinian villages, and you understand that everything down to the very water that they drink and bathe with is segregated and is different, and the apportionment that they get is very different from those in settlements. I mean, this was made very, very clear to me because you have whole settlements where they have country clubs. People have whole swimming pools. And you would be less than a mile away where Palestinians live, and you would have a situation where folks had huge tanks on their roofs where they had to store water because they didn't know if they were going to have enough water for the week. And so we take this segregated path, these segregated roads to Hebron, and we have more rights to navigate on the street than people who live there, than people whose parents live there, than people whose grandparents and great grandparents lived there. I've told the story, several times of being, stopped by a security officer or army officer, whatever he was, about the age of my son, who demanded that I tell him my religion in order to be let pass. And this is actually more complicated and more sinister than it sounds, because if I got to the point where my grandmother was a Christian and he let me pass, but had I had an Arabic name, had I had an Arabic look about me, or had I been, Palestinian, I wouldn't have got past at all. For instance, why a Palestinian Christian? My religion would not matter. See, this is when you start buttressing up against the racism and understand that even though somebody's asking a question about religion, they really aren't asking, do you accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior? That's not what they're asking you. They're asking you something totally, completely different, and asking you to comply with something totally and completely different. And so it was made clear to me, throughout, my entire 10 days, there. And I spent the first 5 with a tour that was primarily led by Arabs and Palestinian Americans from the Levant, from the area. And then the second half, led by a group of dissident Israelis who had served in the IDF. And the clarity of it was just, I've said this before. I went there thinking, I will see something that I probably will not approve of, but it'll be hard for me to disentangle this from that. It's not hard to disentangle at all. It's not like, I could, send anybody over. You don't need a degree, in Middle East studies. You don't need, to be, fluent in Arabic and Hebrew to understand what's going on. It's that clear. And making it complex, portraying it as though you need, all of these degrees or this erudition to understand why people should not be discriminated against is part and parcel to the evil of the system. Every system of oppression says that it's too complex for outsiders to understand. It's nothing unique about Israel in that respect.
Yeah. So speaking of the complexity narrative, actually, one thing that I wanted to touch on, aside from your personal experiences and writing the message, going back to, I guess, the reception where you were interviewed very famously by Tony DeCoppel and I forget the names of the other people involved in the interview. I believe it was a CBS Mornings. It was a Gail King and
Gail King and Nate Burleson.
Yeah.
Nate Burleson,
so Tony DeCoppel basically took control over that interview and did something that I guess upset even other people involved in the editorial process at CBS, where they thought that this did not meet the standard of a normal interview for someone who wrote a book. It was rather contentious and dare I say a little inappropriate, especially when Tony said something along the lines of like, your book is the things that you're saying in the book are things that you would find in the backpack of an extremist. Like, this is imagery that invokes a certain kind of attitude, that you were saying things that were far too radical. Now, aside from that, and aside from like the additional chaos that unfolded internally at CBS, and I think that that division between, I think, like younger members of the media versus older editorial staffers and executives at the highest levels of these companies, that exists in American society pretty broadly. And there's like polling to suggest that as well. Under the age of 35, you see a very different attitude towards Israel and Palestine versus over the age of 35. But outside of that, I think there's something that Tony utilized in that interview where he tried to get you to I think feel like you were biased or one-sided because you were not contextualizing the necessity of apartheid, which is a narrative that you hear so frequently in media, in Western media broadly, where you always see a member of the Israeli occupying force immediately contextualize the violence that is unfolding in front of our eyes. This is something that was happening so frequently in the early month of October in 2023, where you would have Jonathan Conkuncrius or any number of different people that are specifically tasked with going on CNN, sitting across from Jake Tapper, and in English, openly stating why these children had to be killed, like, and why there is a necessity for this violence. And I think that is the dominating attitude in Western media, and I think it provides a disservice. So, how did you feel about, like, how do you feel about the contextualization narrative that, like, no, you can't simply cover one aspect. You can't simply cover a victim-centered conversation. You can't have a victim-centered conversation without explaining why this violence and this dominance has to occur. How does that make you feel?
It makes me feel that the ruling strategies and policies and governance of Israel have much more in common with systems of oppression than people think. I mean, to put it bluntly, I mean, people put that out there, like, to say, okay, this is why this is not apartheid, or this is why this is not Jim Crow. In fact, they sound more like, Jim Crow than, they imagine. People didn't say we need to segregate South Carolina or segregate Mississippi or segregate, Georgia because we are evil and we want to do horrible things to Black people. That's not what they said. They said, look at the crime rates here. Look at this. Look at what these people are doing. Look at how savage they are. They're going to do X, Y, and Z to us. They're going to do this. They had reasons. It's more complicated than you think. You know what I mean? It's not just black and white. That's what they would say. And when people came south and said, this is barbaric, this is horrific, they would say, you don't live down here like us. You don't understand the Negro the way we understand the Negro. That's the same thing they say to me when I go over there for 10 days. It's the exact same thing. They said, you don't understand. You don't live down here. You're not from here. You haven't spent enough time here. If you spent enough time here, you would understand why we have to lynch, rape, and kill these people. And it's a very, similar narrative, right now. It's not that everybody wants to be the hero in their own story. There's always a complicating, reason for why somebody has to, do something. But, I think for me, and this is very, very hard, I think, to get across. And I tried to get it across on CBS. There are things that I'm just against, period. And there's no context that'll make it okay. I'm against eating children. There's no context that's going to make me say,
what if they're delicious?
How you would do that. Right. Right. No, there's no context. I mean, unless facetiously, like I've said, I said this on CBS, I'm against the death penalty. If you told me this person killed 1,000 people, I don't care. I'm still against it. So there is no thing you were going to tell me that Hamas did or that Palestinians did that will make me okay with apartheid. Nothing.
Yeah.
It's just nothing that, you know what I mean? That's a principle thing that cannot be put into context and then made okay. There is no context for slavery for me.
Yeah.
There's no context where it becomes okay.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's that is exactly what a lot of people try to communicate. And I think when you get into the weeds of things, even very educated people who have seen the violence or who have seen the apartheid and recognize it as such, like Ezra Klein, for example, of the New York Times, in your conversation with him, which I thought was fantastic. And I like Ezra. I think I've I have my disagreements with him, but I think over the course of years of listening to him, especially on the New York Times, I've maybe developed a parasocial relationship with him somehow, where I get where he's coming from and I appreciate it, but in that conversation, I think you had a couple moments where you wouldn't let him get away with certain blind spots that he had. Again, it comes across as innocuous, and I think in Ezra's case, it is truly innocuous. I don't think he's ideologically saying I'm committed to liberal Zionism as a project, and that's why I think the West Bank is a separate thing than the broader practices of Israel. But there was this contextualization where he said, Hamas terrorists, but then talked about right-wing settlers. And that, I think, is certainly certainly a part of this process as well, where I like that you wouldn't let him get away with that statement. Like, you wouldn't let that statement hang on its own. That, like, there is a humanizing principle with the way we interpret allies of America, where they're just like people that we have disagreements with, right? People that we can maybe even reason with, regardless of how fundamentalist they might be. And I think it neutralizes the conversation. It almost puts it on the same playing field. And I was wondering what your opinion was on that. Where, like, I'm not even talking about the political designation of terrorism and its practical use in American politics, but I'm simply saying, like, even normalizing the playing field or equalizing the playing field and making it seem as though a group of people that have existed under permanent occupation their whole lives, that have been dominated their whole lives by this brutal occupation and its practices, and their emancipatory goals are cast aside as like the unrealistic and intrinsically violent actions of a barbaric force, right? And I think there is a lot of analogies to old colonial propaganda, old colonial language, whether it be the atrocity propaganda that was added on to the already horrific actions that did take place on October 7, right? This notion that these are barbaric savages. How do you feel about these conversations that take place both behind closed doors and in public with people that are, I think, more like-minded with individuals such as yourself and myself, like closer to us in understanding the truth?
Yeah, I think there is a bias towards officialdom. There's a bias towards authority. It was like I think it's like now kind of dawned on people after seeing so many cell phone videos that cops lie. But cops didn't just recently start lying. You lived in a community like I came up in. You knew the cops lied. What happens is, though, the press will have a cops beat. Like when I was coming up, that was the thing you did. Like you wanted to work at the Washington Post or the New York Times. You had a cops beat. And what that necessarily means in the practice of journalism is you are dependent on the cops for your information. And even though, in your mind, you're being objective, you are dependent on the cops in a way you aren't on the people that they are, quote unquote, at war with. Okay. That's different. That immediately structurally sets up something different in terms of how you cover people. When you're embedded, you know what I mean? And during a war with the soldiers, you are not going to cover them the way you're covering the people that they're fighting. It's just not. You're not covering, the people that you literally are with day in and day out, and that you're embedded with. Embedded, you think about that verb, in the same way that you are the people that are fighting. And so these kind of biases creep through. And I think there's a similar thing, with our journalists, when you start getting to a certain level, because I have to be honest with you. This is the hard thing for me to reckon with that I still haven't, figured out. And so I'll say two things. The first thing I will say is there's a deference to the president of the United States. There's a deference to congressmen. There's a deference to senators. There's a deference to people who are in these official positions. I think that extends to the state of Israel in a way that it does not extend to people who are fighting the state. So two groups of people can do the same barbaric thing, right? But because one has, the kind of sheen of officialdom, because one can put out, fancy press releases that say this was a precision strike, that can, deploy vocabulary that makes it look like either, we didn't target the hospital, or the hospital actually, was a hotbed attack or whatever, because it has its machine, to make it look like, whereas if the quote unquote terrorists just bombed the hospital, this kind of deference would not be given. So that's the first thing. And that is probably the most, sympathetic version of I can give. The one that I am still curious about I have not figured out, and maybe you'll be a lot clearer on this than I am, and maybe I'm still reckoning with my own stuff. That is to say, to the extent to which the press is itself an extension of empire. In other words, this is not a misunderstanding. This is not, a kind of sort of unintentional bias that I, sort of laid out. But there's something else going on, and the thing that I think about most is, many years ago, when it was revealed that this country was waterboarding, people in its custody. And the New York Times, in a practice that it would, had heretofore called torture, would now use the language of the White House and say enhanced interrogation. Like, that's objectivity? What is that?
I mean, it's
what is that, man?
I much like many other people, I grew up in Turkey, so I have a very different attitude towards American empire and its oftentimes very violent ways of operation. So I wasn't sheltered from that, and I didn't grow up with the American exceptionalist attitude. And so that definitely factored into my understanding of the world for sure. But outside of that, I think Noam Chomsky was the way I viewed him. It was like a guy who gets it, right? And I think many people have recognized his positions, especially laid out in Manufacturing Consent, as fairly prescient and very instructive in understanding the way that the media operates. I think that very much exists for all forms of oppression. Like, the media's sole purpose in many instances, and this is not intentional. This is not like people aren't like, I am a card-carrying defender of the State Department, and that's why I'm doing this. I think a lot of people are ideologically committed. I think a lot of people are victims to social conditioning, and those people get elevated through this process within the media, and that's why they are much more willing to play ball. Access journalism is one aspect of this, as you also called out, and I think the other one is just people who simply are intellectually uncurious to dive deeper. You see this in many instances, like the notion that, and I talk to a lot of journalists privately about this stuff in very reputable legacy publishers, where I'm always like, since October 2023, I've constantly asked, like, why does your outlet not feature any of the many Hamas Al-Qassam Brigade updates that are regularly being put out there through Telegram groups? Like, does this have no journalistic value? Like, you don't have to agree with Hamas, but I think it serves a very important purpose to understand the logical through line. And it's seen as like insane to even suggest this. It's not even it's a non-starter. Many people don't do this. And I think that is precisely how you arrive at this false notion that many Americans, if they don't follow social media, if they haven't recognized the humanity of Palestinians, if they only get their information from mainstream media, that's how they constantly find themselves confused in this process, because the president is saying Hamas is actually spoiling the ceasefire negotiations that Israel is on board with, that everybody voted on in the United Nations. And yet that is not the truth. But it's still repeated by Anthony Blinken, and it's still uncritically reported on by mainstream sources. And I think ultimately that causes a lot of people to feel stupid and confused by this process. And especially if they're getting this other information in this day and age, when there are so many outlets, even myself included, that have audience sizes and reach that is almost equivalent to these television networks, where they can get this information all of a sudden they recognize that there is this inconsistency, and that I think plays into the crisis of credibility that mainstream outlets have right now. And as someone who values mainstream media, I always urge whoever will listen to hear me out and say, like, you're dropping the ball at a time, especially when nascent fascism is on the come up in many Western liberal democracies, ours included, that there is a role that real adversarial journalism must play in pursuit of the truth, and losing an entire generation, losing credibility with an entire generation is, I think, a terrifying prospect.
You know, part of what makes this difficult is if I were to look at this in the history of newspapers and media in this country, from the perspective of my ancestors, I would not conclude that American media has distinguished itself in doing what you are assigning here. That is to say, it is impossible to understand the history of lynching and racist terrorism in this country without understanding how newspapers actually abetted it. Not poorly covered it, abetted it. There is, you know, if the Black freedom struggle has been core to the larger freedom struggle in this country, and you ask yourself how media has handled that, you're not going to come away with good answers, you know. And so I think part of the problem is what one might want to see out of these publications. There's no real history. Like, there's no lengthy, you know, history. There are articles, you know what I mean? And even now, and I got to be really careful about this, man, because like I like one of the things I'm thinking about is how I started recently, for instance, picking up the New York Times in paper versus reading it off my phone. And it's a very different experience that I have. There are a number of really hardworking journalists working there.
Oh, yeah.
You know, and I can see that. Like that is much more evident than it is than when I'm, you know, just kind of flicking through my phone. So I don't want to be overly broad here. But what I will say, especially about this topic here that we're talking about, it just isn't a long history of folks distinguishing themselves, man. I mean, it's like there's no past to go back to ask for, you know, that thing. You know, it has to be imagined, and it has to be, you know, different. The one difference I will say is that in the past, because of social media, because of the internet, there just wasn't as much competition. And so they you know, they had to do less, you know, because you owned a newspaper in your town and you dominated that town, or you own one or two newspapers and you competed with one other person, and that was basically it. You know, 2 or 3 news magazines, and that was it. You know, and so it's a very different world now. And my hope is that, you know, part of the catching up will be exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah. You're absolutely correct when you say that there is a long history of upholding unjust systems by the media. And I think the change here is that something I stress, at least like with what I have seen in my 10 years of public advocacy for Palestinian emancipation, is the attitude shift in the Western world by populations, not necessarily by the same like institutions that are desperately trying to cling on to the old way of doing things and trying to defend Israel unconditionally, but simply talking about like the audience's reception to this, to what is actually going on. That has changed dramatically, and I think that we are in a unique moment where there is an opportunity for people to clearly speak to the humanity of the victims, whereas no such opportunity existed in the past. No such opportunity was given because the landscape was entirely dominated. Oh my God, my mom is here and she is so loud in the background. Anne, please turn off the door thing. It is, oh my God. My whole family is here all the time. That's
sorry. My wife was just making coffee or something.
Yeah, it's madness over here in the background. Luckily, no one can hear it because I have a crazy noise gate on my microphone.
I can't hear any of it.
But the point I was trying to make is that there is an opportunity for the first time ever, I think, for people to recognize it. Whereas, like, the global South, people living in countries that are outside of the immediate sphere of American influence, people that are not directly in the heart of empire, they've always known what settler colonialism looks like. You do not have to make an argument to them as to what Israel was doing was wrong. They recognized it immediately. And many other people that have actually been long committed to the struggle against apartheid, like in South Africa, including Nelson Mandela himself, that recognized that this was a dual struggle, that no one was free until Palestinians were free. Nelson Mandela also famously was on the terror watch list until 2008. And I think the changes, however, is that people that, like, the populations living in the Western world, especially younger generations, are shifting their attitude towards this. And I think that while change doesn't happen overnight, I do think that things are certainly changing for the better. So I do hold out hope, regardless of how devastating and dire the situation has been in Lebanon, and now even in Syria as well, where Israel has decided to bomb different Syrian positions and occupy parts of Syria as well in this defensive posture. It's always, like you said, security concerns. Israel's security concerns trump everything else. Everybody has security concerns, We don't believe it when Russia says they have security concerns, and that's why they had to occupy Ukraine. That's a ridiculous argument. We don't believe the denazification narratives when Vladimir Putin is engaging in irredentist action. So why do we believe it when Israel presents that as the exact same reason? And I think people see that. Sorry, go ahead.
I wanted to add two things. First of all, like, I do think you're right about the optimism. There has been a long, painful, lonely struggle waged by Palestinians in Palestine and Palestinians in the broader diaspora to get people to see. And it appears to be bearing fruit here in America. And so I do think that's a very positive development. I think this.
Okay. All right. I believe we are back. Perfect. Okay. I fixed it in real time. That was weird. I don't know what happened there. That was an odd situation, but we're back. Okay. Sorry if you can go back to that last point that you were making.
Yeah, no, I was just saying, we present ourselves as the kind of savior of the Jewish people. Like, we fought World War II, stopped Hitler as he perpetrated, a genocide, and prevented him from, killing more people. But our actual history is much more complicated. The fact of the matter is, even after World War, first of all, we got into the war because of Pearl Harbor. That's the first thing. But the second thing is, even after World War II, there was not a strong and robust movement for taking in what was called then the displaced persons, many of whom obviously were Jewish, who had been driven from their homes and were survivors of a genocide. There was not a strong and robust. On the contrary, there were movements to restrict and cap the number of people that America took in and provided shelter for. And so our relationship to the Jewish people has been complicated, is the nicest way I can say. We are, this notion of us, as savior is complicated and ambiguous. I say that to say, I just, support for what Israel is doing over there and what it has done. I don't know that it's unrelated to our lack of support, in the past. I don't know if that's guilt. I don't know what that is. But it's you end up in some really perverse situations. I guess this is true throughout the West, right? So Masha Gessen, ends up, writing critically about Israel. She's Jewish herself, sending a Holocaust survivor, and she finds herself censored. What? You know what I mean? When you have Jewish writers actually who are quote unquote anti-Israel, and thus being pumped up on anti-Semitism or whatever. That it's like what are we actually defending here? What is actually being fought for here?
Well, I think like aside from the possible like idealism of the situation of the analysis, I think that my analysis on this is always going to factor in a materialist perspective. I think that it's Israel has throughout time and throughout history played different roles for American empire, and they've been a Cold War ally. They have been a punisher of the misbehaving Gulf nation oil states. And most importantly, I think they have been an unsinkable aircraft carrier in a resource-rich region that America wants to dominate. I think that is the continuation of the early Christian Zionist project, even before Theodore Herzl, that we took over from the British basically and have continued. That's, I think, where it comes from ultimately. It's not like a lot of this other stuff in terms of like maybe the guilt or even I think something that a lot of Western Christians do is I think try to cast aside the collective guilt of both the Holocaust and centuries of pogroms over to this new, more valid target to cast the entirety of the Muslim world as operating on these like ancient anti-Semitic attitudes, when history has shown, and maybe this is me being Turkish and hyping up the Ottoman Empire a little bit unjustly, but history has shown that Jewish people did live in this region, and the Ottoman Empire was broadly seen as a safe haven for Jews in times of like the Spanish Inquisition, for example. So like, I think that there is this way of basically saying like, don't look at what we have done in the past, in our history, in our recent history. As a matter of fact, it's actually those Arabs those Muslims that are like deeply anti-Semitic, and we have to fight against them. You see this most you see this, I think, glaring hypocrisy in Germany, where they have this white guilt style collective guilt towards the Holocaust, and instead of addressing it, examining it, understanding it, I think that they have very quickly cast this aside. And you hear people like these fascist movements saying that these Muslims are importing anti-Semitism into our country, and I'm like, it's insane to say that as a German person who was like, who was one generation removed from the perpetrators of the Holocaust, like. And I think that plays a role that suits the Zionist project's purposes. It plays a role in having consistent support from Western nations that Israel needs. And I think something that you also have talked about that I agree with, it is, I think, correct, is that this isn't just Israel's actions. This is our actions, because Israel would not be able to exist in the violent ways that it does without our endless support. America provides 69% of all weapons that Israel uses. That means it's our bombs. It's our targeting systems that are responsible for the killing. It's our tax dollars that are paying for it. It's the political capital that we expend in the global stage to consistently defend and to shelter Israel from worthy scrutiny, from any sort of legal repercussions, as a matter of fact. And that's it. It would not happen if it wasn't for America's allowance. So I don't think, that's why I get very mad, aside from like the obvious bigotries of anti-Semitism being a canary in the coal mine of fascism, I get very mad when I see people talk about this in terms of like Judaism and how this is like somehow ties back to Jews across the board, when it's like, or Israel is dog walking America on the global stage, like Benjamin Netanyahu owns Congress. Like, I understand why people feel that way. But aside from this being a dangerous bigotry, it's just in the simplest terms incorrect. It's just wrong.
Yeah.
There is no world where Israel could behave this way if it wasn't for constant American protection. They are doing this because we allow them to do it. They're doing this because we want them to do it. Anyway, I also now have another interview lined up with Lena Khan after this, so I apologize.
Okay. Sorry.
This was a fantastic conversation. I really, really want to do this again. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, brother. Thank you.
And my mom is bothering me. I have to say this. I want you to tell him I got his book for the content and fell in love with his writing. That's what my mom said. So high marks from a fellow academic. My mom.
Thank you, Hasan's mom. And the writing is the point, so I appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you so much, and I hope to have you on once again in the near future. All right.
Have a good one.
Bye.
All right.
That was Ta-Nehisi Coates, ladies and gentlemen. We are going to